3 true scary stories from Reddit. Game Warden's chilling tales of the haunted wilderness. The wind howled outside, its icy fingers creeping through the cracks of the cabin, making the walls creak as though they were alive. Dave Matthews sat in the corner, a worn leather armchair his only companion. The dim light from a flickering oil lamp cast long shadows on the wooden walls, and the fire crackled softly, offering the only warmth in the otherwise cold, desolate room. Outside, the dense forest whispered, the rustling leaves creating a symphony of uneasy sounds. Dave sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire, his thoughts far away. The years had not been kind to him. His face was weathered, a map of old scars and graying hair. Yet his eyes still carried the intensity of a man who had seen too much, a man who had walked through nightmares and lived to tell the tale. It was clear from the way he sat that he wasn't just thinking about the past. He was bracing for it, knowing that sooner or later, the memories would resurface, uninvited and unforgiving. The only sound, apart from the crackle of the fire, was the occasional gust of wind against the cabin, rattling the window panes. Most people think the wilderness is just a place, Dave muttered, his voice low, gravelly, as though the words were heavy with meaning. They think it's just trees, animals, rocks, a place to escape from the world. But they don't know. They don't know what really lurks out there. It's not just the bears or the wolves you need to watch out for. It's something darker, something that the woods themselves seem to hold close, as if they're guarding a secret too terrifying to be told. He paused, letting the silence settle like a thick fog. Then he set his cup down with a soft thud. He could feel the unease in the air, thick and palpable, the way it always was when he spoke of these things. You want to hear about the real terror of the wilderness? He continued, his gaze never leaving the fire. I'm not talking about animals. I'm not even talking about the isolation, the miles of untamed land that stretch for miles without a soul in sight. I'm talking about something you can't see, something you can't understand. The things that happen when the sun sets and the forest becomes a place where nightmares come to life. Dave leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting on the worn armrests as if he was gathering strength. I've seen things, I've heard things, and I've come to understand that some of those things, some of those stories, are better left untold. But you've got to know, the world outside doesn't understand. The people who sit in their warm houses, staring at their screens, they don't know. They don't know what happens when you venture too far into the wild. He cleared his throat, then sighed. I've heard enough of the so-called true stories about the wilderness. But these stories? These ones, they're real. These are the ones that have haunted me and the men I've worked with. Game wardens, all of us, out there, doing our jobs. And what we've seen, it's not something you can explain. It's something you feel in your bones, something you can't unsee once you've seen it. Dave set the mug down and met the unseen listener's gaze. The air grew colder, the wind picking up again outside, as if the forest itself was listening in. I've got 3 stories for you, Dave said, his voice steady, but with a hint of something darker underneath. 3 stories I personally lived through. Stories from the wilderness, from the men who serve it. Each one of us witnessed something that made us question what we thought we knew about the world. These aren't your typical encounters with poachers or lost hikers. These are stories about things that shouldn't be, about things that don't belong in the wild. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as if he was already reliving the memories. The first story takes place deep in a forest, so thick and isolated that even the locals avoid it. The second story comes from a place where the trees seem to whisper your name, and the land itself makes its own rules. The last one, well, let's just say it's about a presence that you can't see, but you can feel, something that watches you, and only when you're alone, deep in the woods, does it reveal itself. Dave's voice grew quieter, more deliberate. Each one of these stories will make you question everything you thought you knew. And by the end of it, you'll understand what I mean when I say that the wilderness is not a place for the faint of heart. It's a place for those who are ready to face something far darker than they ever imagined. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, the fires crackling the only sound between them. Now, I'll tell you these stories. But remember this. Once you hear them, there's no going back. Some things, once you know them, stay with you forever. And so, with that final warning hanging heavy in the air, Dave began to recount the first of his 3 terrifying stories, each one rooted deep in the heart of the wilderness, each one more disturbing than the last. Story 1. The Haunted Forest. The Beast That Wasn't There. It was an unusually cold morning when Dave Matthews and his partner, John, set out into the dense, untouched wilderness of the Western Mountains. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, a scent that never quite seemed to leave the forest. The trees towered above them, ancient giants that had stood for centuries, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The 2 game wardens were used to the isolation. It was a part of the job. They were no strangers to the silent majesty of the wild, or to the dangerous poachers that lurked within it. But this time was different. The call had come in just after dawn. Illegal hunters, spotted in an area so remote that the locals rarely ventured near it. Dave and John had been sent to investigate, tasked with tracking down the offenders. What they didn't know, what neither of them could have predicted, was that they were about to uncover something far worse than poachers. Something they weren't prepared for. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the thick canopy overhead blocked out much of the sunlight, casting the forest floor in shadow. They made their way through brambles and over fallen logs, the crunch of leaves beneath their boots the only sound in the otherwise silent woods. The only company they had was the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves as squirrels and other small creatures moved through the underbrush. It wasn't long before Dave began to feel uneasy. At first, it was a vague sense that something was off. The air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. But then came the footsteps. At first, it was subtle, a faint crunch of leaves behind them, barely noticeable. Dave thought it was just John, perhaps a branch snapping under his foot. But when the sound repeated, he turned around, expecting to see his partner just behind him. To his surprise, there was nothing. "John," he called out, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. John, who had been in the lead, didn't answer. Dave quickened his pace, catching up to his partner, who was now walking with his eyes darting around the forest, clearly uneasy as well. "You hear that?" Dave asked, his voice low, though he wasn't sure if he wanted the answer. John nodded, his expression grim. "I've been hearing it for a while, like someone's walking behind us." They continued on, but the footsteps continued to follow them. As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the sound of the following footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Someone or something was keeping pace with them. "It's probably just an animal," John muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Could be a deer or something." But the sound didn't match the random, uneven pattern of an animal's movement. It was too consistent, too rhythmic. It was following them step by step. Dave's senses were on edge now, his mind racing through every possible explanation. But none of them made sense. They were deep in the forest, far from any known paths. No one should have been out here. Not a poacher, not a hiker, certainly not a person. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a low growl broke through the eerie silence of the woods. It was guttural, deep, a sound that seemed to reverberate in Dave's chest. He froze, his heart pounding in his ears. "Did you hear that?" Dave whispered, though the growl had been so loud that there was no need to ask. John didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto something in the distance, a clearing up ahead where the trees began to thin out. There, in the midst of the trees, was an old cabin, abandoned. The door was half open, and the windows were shattered, a hollow shell of what it once had been. Without speaking, the 2 men moved toward the cabin, the growl still echoing in their ears. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. Every step they took seemed to be met by 1,000 unseen eyes, all staring, waiting, and watching. The cabin smelled of rot, the air thick with the stench of decay. Inside, the floorboards creaked underfoot as they stepped carefully around piles of old debris. The walls were scratched with strange symbols, etched deeply into the wood. Symbols that Dave didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The corner of his eye caught something glinting in the low light, a rusted hunting trap, abandoned and left half open. But there was no sign of the poachers. Then, As they moved toward the back of the cabin, something shifted in the trees. A shadow. It was massive. Too massive to be a man, too strange to be an animal. Dave's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. A hulking, dark figure just beyond the tree line. It moved with incredible speed, slipping through the mist like it was part of the very forest itself. "John!" Dave's voice trembled as he reached for his partner. But John was already backing away, his eyes wide with fear. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the dense fog that had begun to creep through the trees. Dave stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He could still feel the weight of those eyes upon him, watching, waiting. "What the hell was that?" John whispered, his voice barely audible. Dave didn't have an answer. Whatever it wasn't a bear or a man. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the forest. They didn't stick around to find out. They turned and hurried back the way they came, the sound of their own footsteps blending with the soft growl in the distance. Whatever had watched them, whatever they had glimpsed in the trees, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And neither of them would ever speak of it again. The days following their harrowing encounter with the shadowy figure in the forest were long and fraught with unease. Dave and John tried to go back to their normal routines, but the memory of what they had seen, or perhaps what they hadn't seen, weighed heavily on them. The forest had never felt the same. When they finally returned with a group of other game wardens, they were determined to uncover the truth. But what they found in the forest left them with more questions than answers. The first thing that struck Dave as they entered the area was the disturbing stillness. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of the leaves, the distant calls of birds, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush, were missing. It was as though the entire forest had gone silent, holding its breath in anticipation. The trees seemed to loom over them like silent sentinels, their twisted branches swaying in the wind as if beckoning them closer. As they approached the abandoned cabin, Dave's eyes scanned the ground for any signs of the beast they had seen, the hulking shadow that had disappeared into the mist. They had expected to find broken branches, crushed leaves, or, at the very least, footprints, something that would confirm what they had witnessed was real. But there was nothing, no signs of a large creature passing through. The forest floor was undisturbed, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened there. Dave knelt down and ran his fingers through the dirt, trying to make sense of it all. "It's like it was never here," he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. The others gathered around, all equally perplexed by the lack of evidence. John, who had been quiet since they arrived, finally spoke up. "Maybe we're just looking in the wrong place. The thing, it wasn't like any animal I've ever seen." "I know," Dave replied, his voice heavy with the unshakable feeling that something was off. "But there's no sign of it, not a single clue." The other wardens seemed to share his growing sense of unease, their gazes flickering nervously between the trees and the cabin. They had all been trained to track animals, to find poachers, to protect the forest from harm, but they had never been prepared for something like this. Whatever they had encountered, it wasn't something they could explain with their experience. They spent the rest of the day combing the area, looking for anything that might offer an explanation. A footprint, a scratch, any sign that would suggest the beast had been there. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, it was clear that their efforts were in vain. The forest had closed ranks around them, as if it were hiding something they were not meant to find. That night, the strange occurrences began again. As the wardens set up camp near the edge of the woods, the wind picking up and sending a chill through the air, they gathered around the fire, speaking in hushed tones. No one dared venture too far into the dark forest. But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, the growl returned. Low and guttural, it rolled through the trees like distant thunder. The sound was unmistakable, and it was coming from somewhere near the cabin. Dave stood up, his heart racing. The growl was too close now. He exchanged a glance with John, who looked pale and withdrawn. John had been silent the entire day, his eyes constantly scanning the edge of the forest, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "We're not alone," John whispered, almost to himself. His voice trembled with fear. Dave nodded, but he didn't speak. He knew that whatever they were hearing was no ordinary animal. The sound was far too deliberate, far too unnatural. The growl intensified, a low rumble that seemed to reverberate through the air. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway violently, but the sound of the growl continued, cutting through the rustling leaves. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Dave's eyes darted to the darkened tree-line. Something moved in the shadows, a shape just beyond the reach of the firelight. A fleeting glimpse, that was all he saw, just the briefest movement like a figure slipping between the trees. His hand went to his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, another sound reached his ears. A snapping of twigs, slow, deliberate. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The footsteps were followed by the feeling of being watched. It was the same sensation that Dave and John had felt before, the one that had plagued them since their encounter. The trees seemed to press in around them, their gnarled branches reaching toward the campfire like skeletal hands. Dave's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He signaled for the others to remain still, stay quiet. Then, just like that, the footsteps ceased. The night passed without incident, but no one slept. The eerie growl continued to haunt them, as if it were following them through the woods. Every night, the same sounds. Every night, the same sense of something lurking just beyond the firelight. John, who had been visibly shaken since their first encounter with the shadowy figure, grew even more withdrawn. He spoke less and less, his eyes darting nervously around the camp. Dave could see the fear in his partner's eyes, a fear that went beyond any animal encounter he had ever witnessed. It wasn't just the forest that was getting to John, it was something more primal, something darker. Finally, Dave couldn't ignore it any longer. The creature they had encountered, the beast that had never left a trace, wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something older, something that had been lurking in those woods for far longer than either of them could comprehend. Over the next few days, Dave pored over every bit of information he could find, speaking with other wardens, checking local folklore, and researching the history of the area. What he discovered left him with more questions than answers. There were whispers, old stories told around campfires, about a creature that haunted these woods, a shadow that stalked the trees and preyed upon anyone who ventured too far. It wasn't a bear, a wolf, or any animal that had been recorded in the area. It was something far more supernatural, something that defied explanation. The creature was a myth, a legend, a haunting that had existed for centuries. And now it had returned. As Dave sat alone in the cabin, the fire crackling softly beside him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over him. Whatever it was, the creature was not of this world. It was something ancient, something that had been hiding in the woods, watching, waiting, and it was not finished with him yet. Story 2. The Whispers in the Trees. The Spirits of the Lost Hunters. It was years after the unsettling events in the haunted forest that Dave found himself in a new wilderness, far more remote and far less forgiving. The land was rugged, its harsh beauty marked by thick woods, jagged cliffs, and streams that twisted and turned like the veins of the earth. The air was dry here, heavy with the scent of pine and earth. The isolation was complete. It was the kind of place that had the power to make a man feel small, insignificant, and vulnerable. Dave was no longer a rookie, but even with his decades of experience, there was something about this wilderness that felt different, darker. It was a place that demanded respect and warned against curiosity. This time, he was assigned to work with a young game warden named Ryan. Ryan was eager, energetic, and had that fresh enthusiasm that only someone new to the job could have. He looked at Dave as though he were a seasoned mentor, someone whose words were to be treated with the kind of reverence that only years of experience could warrant. Their first night in the field was spent setting up camp in a small clearing just beyond a dense grove of trees. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bathed in twilight. As the campfire crackled, Ryan couldn't resist breaking the silence with a story that seemed to have been born from the very air of this strange land. "You know," Ryan said, poking at the fire with a stick, "there's an old legend about these woods." Dave raised an eyebrow. He had heard his fair share of ghost stories and tall tales in his time as a warden, but this one seemed to have a different weight to it. He didn't say anything, just leaned back against a nearby rock and listened. Ryan, sensing an opportunity to impress, continued. They say that the spirits of lost hunters wander these woods, especially at night. They never made it out, and now they're trapped here, forever searching for their way home. Ryan paused, letting the words hang in the air. But here's the kicker. It's not just that they wander. They whisper. Dave felt a subtle shift in the air as Ryan spoke, the cool breeze brushing through the branches above them, as though the forest itself was listening. He stared into the fire, his face flickering in the orange light, but his mind was already beginning to churn with the implications of Ryan's words. They say the whispers are a warning. If you hear them, you're too deep in the forest. You're in their territory, and you need to leave before it's too late. Ryan's voice took on an almost mocking tone, as if he didn't truly believe the tale he was telling. He looked over at Dave with a grin, expecting a laugh, but instead, Dave's gaze remained fixed, thoughtful. That's an old story, Dave said, his voice low but steady. Folklore mostly. Things like that can keep a man cautious, make him second-guess every shadow in the trees. Ryan chuckled, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his laughter. Yeah, I know, but you can't deny it's a little creepy, right? He gestured to the dark woods surrounding them, the shadows growing longer as night settled in. Who knows what's out there? Dave didn't respond right away. He had heard similar stories before, but something about the way Ryan spoke made the tale seem more real, more grounded in the very fabric of the forest they were now a part of. The wind shifted, and with it came a sudden chill that made Dave pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The fire popped, sending a small burst of embers into the air. For a moment, the two men were silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, the wind carried something else, a faint sound, barely audible, almost indistinguishable from the normal night sounds of the forest. It was a whisper, a voice, low and faint, almost like it was being carried on the wind. Dave froze. He looked over at Ryan, who seemed oblivious, his eyes still fixed on the fire. Another whisper came, this time more distinct. It wasn't in any language Dave recognized, just a soft murmur, like a faint hum. Did you hear that? Dave asked quietly, his eyes scanning the darkening tree line. Ryan glanced up, confused at first, but then he nodded, the unease creeping into his expression. Hear what? Ryan asked, though he too seemed to be listening now, his head tilting slightly toward the trees. Another whisper, louder this time. It sounded almost like a name, but it was impossible to make out. It came from deeper in the forest, distant but clear, as though someone was trying to speak to them from the shadows. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's not funny, Dave. Stop messing around. I'm not messing around, Dave said, his voice low and serious. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had heard enough in his time out here to recognize the signs of something unnatural, something that wasn't supposed to be. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Now there were multiple voices, layered on top of each other, murmuring words that danced just out of reach of understanding. They seemed to swirl around them, coming from all directions, as if the trees themselves were speaking. Ryan's face went pale. What the hell is that? He whispered, his eyes darting nervously from one tree to the next, his voice trembling. It's like they're calling us. Dave didn't answer right away. He had been in the wilderness long enough to know when it was time to leave. This wasn't just some harmless wind or animal noises. There was something intentional about the whispers, a purpose behind them. Stay close, Dave said firmly, his instincts kicking in. We need to pack up and head back to the truck. Now! Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat as another whisper cut through the air, clearer this time. Leave now, or never leave. The words were unmistakable. It was a warning, and it was coming from the forest itself. Dave's heart began to race as he stood, grabbing his gear and motioning for Ryan to do the same. We're not sticking around to find out what that means, he said, his voice sharp. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder as they hurried to pack their things. Surrounding them, seeping into their minds. As they finished gathering their equipment, Dave cast one last look at the trees, the darkened shapes looming like sentinels in the night. The wind picked up, and as they hurried toward the truck, the last whisper came through loud and clear. "You shouldn't have come." It was a voice that sounded both ancient and filled with sorrow, and it echoed in Dave's mind long after they had driven away from the haunted woods. Later, when they had reached safety and the night had settled into uneasy silence, Ryan sat in the truck, his face pale and shaken. He didn't speak, but his eyes were wide, his gaze distant. "I told you," Dave said quietly, breaking the silence. "Some things aren't meant to be explored." Ryan nodded slowly, still trying to process what had happened, but Dave knew that his young partner would never forget the whispers in the trees, or the warning they had brought. The days that followed their unsettling encounter around the campfire only deepened the sense of dread that hung over Dave and Ryan. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent, growing louder with each passing day, almost as if the spirits were aware of their presence and were trying to communicate with them. Ryan's nerves, once steady, began to fray at the edges. At first, it was just a faint unease, a slight discomfort whenever the wind picked up or the trees creaked in the night. But as time wore on, it became something far more tangible, far more sinister. Ryan began to hear the whispers even when they were miles away from the clearing. They'd echo in his mind, a constant hum that refused to be ignored. They were not just whispers, they were warnings, threats, and sometimes commands. But it wasn't just the whispers that haunted him. Ryan began to see things. Shadowy figures that drifted between the trees, ethereal and indistinct, vanishing the moment he tried to approach them. His mind told him they were illusions, mere tricks of the light or the forest's shifting shadows. But deep down, Ryan knew that something wasn't right. Something was watching them, something far older and more malevolent than anything he had ever encountered in his training. One evening, after a long day of patrol, Dave and Ryan were sitting outside the ranger station, staring into the fading light of dusk. Ryan was unusually quiet, his face drawn and pale. Dave noticed the distant look in his eyes, the way he seemed to flinch at every rustle of the leaves or crack of a twig in the woods around them. "Hey, you okay?" Dave asked, his voice filled with concern. Ryan had been acting strange for days now, and Dave wasn't sure what was going on. Ryan nodded, but his eyes darted around the clearing. "I don't know, Dave. Something feels wrong. Like I'm being watched all the time. Every step I take, I feel them." "Who?" Dave asked, his brow furrowing. "The spirits," Ryan whispered, as though speaking their name out loud would make them real. "I hear them more now, and sometimes I see them, figures, shadows in the woods. But when I look, they're gone." Dave's heart skipped a beat. He'd heard the stories, of course, but seeing Ryan's distressed state, he realized just how much the forest was getting to him. "Maybe you need some rest," Dave suggested. "We've been out here for a while. It's easy to get lost in your head when you're out in the woods alone. Let's head inside and take a break." Ryan didn't respond. He just kept staring into the darkening trees, his gaze fixed and unblinking, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. It wasn't long after that the situation took a terrifying turn. The very next evening, after a long patrol, Dave went inside to prepare some food while Ryan stayed behind outside, sitting on the steps as usual, his eyes scanning the woods with a fixed, obsessive intensity. Dave had just finished putting together a simple dinner when he heard a faint sound, a voice, low and distant, calling Ryan's name. At first, Dave thought it was just the wind, but when it came again, clearer and more distinct, a chill crept up his spine. The voice sounded wrong, unnatural. "Ryan," Dave called out, stepping toward the door, but before he could get outside, Ryan's form appeared in the doorway, his expression vacant, his eyes glazed over. He didn't respond when Dave called his name again. His lips moved, but no words came out. "Ryan," Dave said, stepping closer, now deeply worried. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Ryan didn't answer, but his eyes shifted toward the woods, his gaze unblinking and unseeing. He seemed completely unaware of Dave's presence. Without warning, Ryan took a step forward, walking toward the trees. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were being guided by some invisible force. Dave called his name again, but Ryan didn't respond. It was as if he couldn't hear him at all. His eyes were fixed ahead, his lips moving, but his voice was muffled, as if speaking in a language Dave couldn't understand. "Ryan!" Dave shouted, grabbing his arm to stop him, but Ryan pulled away with unnatural strength. "We need to go back to the station now." But Ryan didn't listen. He continued walking, each step taking him further into the forest, toward the place where the whispers had first started. Dave's heart pounded in his chest as he chased after him, panic rising in his throat. Something was wrong. The Ryan he knew was no longer there. By the time Dave caught up to him, they had crossed into the deepest part of the woods, the part where the trees were thick, the air heavy with a sense of something watching them. Ryan was standing at the base of an ancient oak tree, his back to Dave, muttering in a language that wasn't of this world. "Ryan, what are you doing?" Dave asked, his voice shaky. Ryan didn't respond. He simply continued to speak, his words growing faster and more frantic, as if he were reciting something from memory, something ancient. Dave's heart raced as he realized Ryan wasn't just talking. He was pleading, whispering to the spirits in the woods, calling to them with words that made Dave's skin crawl. Suddenly, Ryan stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes locked onto Dave's, but there was no recognition in them. They were empty, hollow. "Help me," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. "They want me to stay. They want me to stay with them." Before Dave could respond, a gust of wind howled through the trees, and the whispers grew louder, as if the spirits were surrounding them. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the forest itself were alive, reaching out to claim them. Dave's mind raced. He knew that they had ventured too deep, that they had disturbed something ancient, something that wasn't ready to let them go. In a panic, Dave grabbed Ryan by the shoulders, shaking him. "We need to get out of here, Ryan. Come on." But Ryan didn't move. His body was rigid, his face frozen in a trance-like expression, his voice continuing to murmur, indistinguishable from the whispers that now surrounded them. Dave's instincts kicked in. He spun Ryan around and began dragging him back toward the ranger station, desperate to escape the growing malevolent presence that seemed to haunt every step they took. The moment they crossed the threshold of the camp, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, but the silence was deafening. Ryan collapsed into Dave's arms, his body trembling, his eyes wide with terror. It was clear that whatever had happened out there, whatever had taken hold of him, was far more than just a trick of the mind. Ryan was never the same after that night. His once lively demeanor became a distant memory, replaced by a hollow, haunted version of the man he used to be. He became obsessed with the idea that the spirits of the forest were always watching him, calling him back into their grasp. Days turned into weeks, but no matter how hard Dave tried to talk to him, Ryan never seemed to recover. He became withdrawn, paranoid, and obsessed with returning to the woods. His sanity slowly crumbled, and it wasn't long before he left, disappearing into the wilderness, as though he was being pulled by some unseen force. Dave never saw him again. Dave knew the truth now. What they had encountered in the forest wasn't just some figment of Ryan's imagination. It was something real, something supernatural, a malevolent presence that lured those who ventured too deep into its domain. And once it had you, it never let you go. The spirits of the lost hunters had claimed another soul. Story 3. The Invisible Watcher, the Eye in the Sky. Dave had been a game warden for decades, and as his career neared its end, the weight of experience hung heavily on him. His final assignment took him deep into one of the most remote and unforgiving regions of the wilderness, a vast expanse known for its dense forests, towering mountains, and treacherous terrain. The area had been plagued by reports of illegal poaching, and it was up to Dave to put a stop to it once and for all. His first few days in the wilderness were typical for such an assignment. Long hours patrolling the rough, unmarked trails, setting up surveillance in key areas, and keeping a sharp eye out for any signs of poacher activity. Yet, even from the start, something felt off. It wasn't the wild, untamed nature of the place that unsettled him. It was the feeling that someone or something was always watching him. At first, Dave chalked it up to paranoia. The wilderness had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially after hours spent alone in the silence of nature. But as the days passed, the feeling didn't go away. It grew. No matter where he went, no matter how he altered his path, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was just behind him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. He would catch glimpses out of the corner of his eye, movements, flashes of something dark in the trees, a sudden rustling of leaves that felt too deliberate to be the wind. Every time he turned to look, there was nothing there, just the quiet wilderness stretching out before him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, his instincts screaming that he wasn't alone. At night, the feeling only intensified. Dave set up camp in a small clearing, the firelight flickering against the trees as the darkness swallowed the forest. His eyes darted between the crackling fire and the surrounding woods, unable to shake the nagging sense that something, or someone, was out there, watching him. He decided to check his gear before settling down for the night, double-checking his rifle, his food supplies, and his equipment. As he moved around the camp, he noticed something strange. The pack had been moved. The straps were shifted. The contents inside had been rearranged. Dave was certain he hadn't touched it. He immediately scanned the area for any signs of an intruder, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbances in the ground. That's when he saw it. A silhouette in the distance, standing motionless against the backdrop of the fading twilight. It was too far to make out details, but it was unmistakably a figure, a shape against the horizon. Dave's pulse quickened. Was it a person? A poacher? He reached for his rifle, but before he could bring it up to his shoulder, the figure vanished, melting into the darkness as though it had never existed. His breath caught in his throat. He waited for a long moment, scanning the shadows, his eyes darting between the trees. But there was no sign of movement, no indication that anything had been there at all. Dave shook his head, trying to rationalize it. The wilderness could play tricks on you, especially when you've been isolated for too long. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree or a rock. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. That night, Dave barely slept. He kept his rifle close, the sound of the crackling fire filling the silence around him. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves made his heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the firelight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Dave awoke to a scene that only confirmed his worst fears. His camp was undisturbed, but his equipment had been tampered with. His knife was missing from its sheath, the spare ammunition had been rifled through, and his water bottles had been moved. Whoever, or whatever, had been watching him had come closer overnight. He scanned the area again, looking for any sign of a trail, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of an intruder. It was as if the wilderness itself had swallowed up any trace of what had happened. For the next few days, Dave continued his patrols, but the feeling of being watched never left him. He was more vigilant than ever, keeping his eyes trained on the trees and the ground around him, listening for the slightest sound that might indicate someone was nearby. But there was no sign of anyone, no poachers, no movement, nothing. And yet, every time he stopped to rest or take a break, the sensation of being watched would return. It was as if something invisible was following him, tracking his every move, always staying just out of sight. One afternoon, while traversing a steep ridge, Dave noticed something strange. The shadows seemed deeper, longer than they should have been, and the air felt unnaturally still. As he paused to catch his breath, he saw it again, a shadow moving between the trees, too fast for him to get a good look at, but it was unmistakable. Something was out there. His pulse quickened, and he moved carefully, keeping low to the ground, his eyes scanning every corner of the forest. But there was no sign of the shadow, no sound of movement. The forest was silent once again. That night, Dave made the decision to leave the area. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted, that something was watching him from the trees, and he wasn't about to take any chances. He packed his gear quickly, his mind racing, and began making his way toward the ranger station. But as he walked, the feeling of being followed only intensified. The sounds of the forest seemed to shift, becoming more distant, as though the trees themselves were closing in around him. Every step felt like he was moving deeper into something, and every movement felt like it was being observed by a watchful eye. That night, he camped near the base of a cliff, the wind howling through the trees. The eerie silence had returned, but Dave couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the darkness, watching from the shadows. As he lay in his tent, he heard it again, the sound of movement in the trees. Slow, deliberate, like something was stalking him. He held his breath, trying to listen, but there was no sound, no rustling leaves, no snap of a twig. Just the steady, unbroken silence of the night. The next morning, his fears were confirmed. His equipment had been tampered with once again. His rifle, which he'd placed by his side the night before, had been moved. The scope was turned, the sights misaligned. His food rations had been rearranged, and his map had been unfolded, as though someone had been studying it. Dave had had enough. He knew that whatever was watching him, whatever was following him, wasn't human. It wasn't a poacher, or an animal, or even some natural force of the wilderness. It was something else. Something that had been in these woods long before he arrived. Something that had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. With a sense of finality, Dave packed up his gear and made the long trek back to civilization. The invisible watcher never left his thoughts, the presence of the unseen hunter still heavy in his mind. And though he never spoke of it to anyone, Dave knew the truth. He had been hunted, watched by something far older and more powerful than anything he could comprehend. He retired shortly after, but the memory of the eye in the sky, the invisible watcher who had followed him through the wilderness, would never leave him. And whenever he closed his eyes at night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hunter was still out there, waiting. The weeks following Dave's unsettling encounter with the shadowy figure in the wilderness seemed to drag on. Each day spent in the tense, eerie quiet of the vast, untamed land. The invisible presence that had stalked him grew more intense, more suffocating. His every step felt as though it were being watched, his every breath held in the grip of something beyond human comprehension. Dave couldn't explain the feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. It was as if the wilderness itself was alive, sentient, and somehow aware of his every move. The sensation of being followed had only grown stronger. Shadows in the trees seemed to linger just a little too long, and the whispers in the wind carried a weight, an unspoken warning that he was no longer welcome. But as much as he tried to push it out of his mind, Dave knew that this was no coincidence. Something or someone was watching him, and it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real. One evening, while following the edge of a narrow ravine, Dave paused to take a breath. His boots crunched softly in the gravel as he looked out over the wilderness, the last slivers of daylight slowly fading behind the distant mountains. There in the distance he saw it again, the shadow, the unmistakable silhouette of a figure moving between the trees, just on the edge of his vision. This time, Dave was ready, his heart pounding in his chest. He took off toward the shadow, his breath sharp and shallow. The terrain was rugged, the underbrush thick, but Dave pushed forward, driven by a sense of urgency he couldn't fully explain. He knew he had to confront whatever was watching him, whatever was following him through this wilderness. He couldn't run any longer. As he reached the spot where the shadow had been, he found nothing. The forest stretched out before him, silent and still. No footprints, no signs of movement, only the deepening darkness closing in around him. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, the kind that rattles your bones and makes your blood run cold. It came from the trees, but it didn't sound like any animal Dave had ever heard before. It was otherworldly, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. The growl was followed by something else, a voice, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, then louder, more distinct, until it echoed through the trees. "You shouldn't have come here." The word sent a chill through Dave's entire being. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but the weapon suddenly felt useless. The growl and the voice melded into one, a dark, malevolent presence that wrapped around him like a heavy fog. "Who are you?" Dave demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound firm. "What do you want?" From the darkness, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something far more sinister, something ancient and unknowable. As Dave's eyes strained to pierce the dark, he caught a glimpse of a figure, but it wasn't solid. It shimmered like a shadow, a distortion in the very fabric of the air. The figure seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, but not in the way anything human or animal could be. It was a thing of the forest, born from the very soil and trees that had stood here for centuries. The voice spoke again, louder this time, its tone colder and more threatening. "You have trespassed on sacred ground, and now you must pay the price." Dave's heart raced. This wasn't just some poacher, some rogue hunter who had gone mad in the wilderness. This was something far older, a force tied to the land itself. The word struck him like a blow to the chest, and he realized with a sinking feeling that this entity wasn't just stalking him. It had been stalking the land for decades, perhaps longer. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone foolish enough to disturb its peace. "You are not the first," the voice continued, its presence growing stronger, closer. "And you will not be the last." As the figure stepped forward, Dave could make out more details. It was humanoid, but not quite. Its form was shifting, ever-changing, as if it were a reflection in the water, rippling and warping. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly, too cold, empty orbs that seemed to look right through him. The creature stepped closer, and Dave could feel the air around him growing colder, heavier. It wasn't a physical cold. It was a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to penetrate his bones, freezing him in place. His legs felt weak, and he had to force himself to stay upright. "You've come to claim what's mine," the voice said again, its tone growing sharper, more insistent. "But the land has already claimed you." Suddenly, everything around Dave seemed to distort. The trees, the rocks, the very ground beneath his feet all seemed to shift and ripple like a mirage. The air was thick with an oppressive force, a presence that seemed to stretch beyond the physical realm. In that moment, Dave understood. The entity wasn't just a creature. It was a manifestation of the forest itself, a vengeful spirit bound to the land, to the cursed hunting ground. It was not just protecting its territory. It was punishing those who dared to trespass. It had watched generations of hunters come and go, claiming their sanity, their lives, leaving them lost and broken. "You won't leave here," the voice hissed. "Not unless you face your deepest fear." The world seemed to fade around Dave, the trees bending and warping in ways that defied nature. The shadows closed in, and he could hear his heart pounding in his ears. The figure before him loomed larger, its form shifting, becoming more and more monstrous. He could feel the entity's grip tightening on his soul, forcing him to confront the fear he had buried deep within himself. But Dave had one last trick up his sleeve. His instincts kicked in, and with a sudden burst of adrenaline, he dropped to the ground, pulling himself out of the entity's grip. He reached for his rifle, but the weapon felt like dead weight in his hands. The forest seemed to close in, the trees pressing together like they were alive, trapping him in the nightmare. He had to act fast. In a final, desperate act, Dave ran. He didn't look back, didn't stop to think. He charged through the trees, hearing the growls and whispers grow louder, more insistent, urging him to turn around, to face his fear. But Dave didn't. He pushed forward, the darkness of the woods wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. With every step, he felt the presence of the entity chasing him, felt its cold breath on his neck. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for him, but he kept running, kept moving forward. And then, just as he thought he couldn't go any further, he broke through the trees and into the open. The moment Dave stepped into the clearing, the oppressive presence lifted. The growls and whispers faded, and the forest seemed to return to its natural state. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could breathe freely. But the terror of that encounter stayed with him, burned into his memory like a scar. The entity was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching, waiting for the next person to trespass. It was bound to the land, tied to the ancient hunting grounds that had been cursed long ago. As Dave made his way back to civilization, he knew one thing for sure. The invisible watcher had seen him, had known his deepest fears, and had shown him what lay beyond the veil. And no matter how far he ran, he would never escape the terror that lurked in the heart of the wilderness. Dave retired shortly after that encounter, but the shadows of that night followed him for the rest of his life. The invisible watcher had left its mark on him, and it would never let him forget. As the final embers of the fire crackled and the shadows of the night stretched long across the rugged wilderness, Dave paused. The silence that followed his recounting of the chilling stories seemed almost unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He sat back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his eyes clouded with memories of the horrors he had witnessed over the years. There was no longer any trace of the young, eager ranger he had once been. Time had worn him down, but the lessons he'd learned from the wilderness had only sharpened with age. "Let me tell you something," he began, his voice now soft, but carrying the weight of years spent in the heart of nature's most untamed places. "All these stories, they aren't just about what you can see. They're about what you can't. You think you're safe, that you can conquer the wilderness with your skills, your knowledge of the land. But you're wrong. There's something out there, something older than any of us. It's been here long before we ever set foot in these woods, and it'll be here long after we're gone." He looked up at the moon, now high in the sky, its pale light casting an eerie glow on the trees around them. The wind had picked up, and it seemed to whisper through the branches. Dave shuddered slightly, not from the chill in the air, but from the memories that the night stirred in him. "The wilderness isn't just trees and animals," he continued, his gaze distant. "It's a realm of forces and spirits, ancient and powerful. Most people don't realize that. We think we're the ones who control it, that we can shape it, protect it, and make it our own. But the truth is we're just visitors. The land has its own rules, its own balance. And when we disturb it, when we break those rules, we awaken something we can't understand." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with the listeners. "And that's the real terror. Not the bears or the storms. Not the poison ivy or the rattlesnakes. The real terror is what lies just beyond our perception. The things we can't see, the things that don't follow the same laws of nature we think we know so well. Those are the things you need to fear." Dave's voice grew more solemn, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. "I've seen it, felt it, in the quiet of the night, in the stillness of the forest. It's out there, watching, waiting." He took a deep breath, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. "And the worst part? You can't fight it. You can't outrun it. You can only hope it lets you go." There was a long silence as Dave's words hung in the air, the only sound the rustling of the trees as the wind howled through the branches. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softer but no less firm. "Game wardens, park rangers like me, we're tasked with preserving the land, keeping it safe for the people who come to visit. But the truth is, we often fail to realize that the land itself is preserving something far older, far darker than any of us can fathom. It doesn't need protecting from people like us. It's us who need to be protected from it." He paused, the weight of his experiences evident in his weary eyes. "These places, the ones I've told you about, they're not meant to be disturbed. Some things are better left untouched, buried deep in the earth, where they belong. The wilderness holds its secrets, and some of those secrets should stay hidden, for the good of all." Dave sat back again, his face drawn and tired. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on his weathered features. "I've lived a long life, seen a lot, and in the end, it all comes down to this. No matter how strong, how experienced you think you are, there are forces in this world that you cannot control. Forces that have been here long before we ever set foot on this land, and forces that will remain long after we're gone." He looked once more at the vast, dark expanse of the wilderness that stretched out before him. His expression was one of quiet resignation, mixed with a hint of sorrow. "And that, my friend, is the terrifying truth." The fire had burned low now, its orange glow casting the night in a soft, flickering light. The trees around them seemed to stand taller in the darkness, the wilderness stretching out as far as the eye could see. Dave's voice had become quieter, more reflective, as he spoke once more, his thoughts turning inward to a time when he had been young, full of fire, and driven by the belief that he could master nature. Sometimes, he said, his voice carrying a weight of experience, I wonder if we ever really understand what we're dealing with. The wilderness, it doesn't just belong to us. It never did. We're just passing through, trying to leave our mark, but it's the land that leaves its mark on us if we're not careful. He let out a long, slow breath, his eyes lost in the distance, as if looking back to a time before his retirement, before the stories he had lived through had turned his perception of the world upside down. I used to think that we could tame these places, that we could keep the land safe from those who would harm it. But now I know better. Some things in nature, they should never be disturbed. There are places, like the ones I've visited, that are meant to remain untouched. Places where the past still lingers, where the ancient spirits of the forest watch and wait and sometimes punish those who stray too far. Dave paused, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness, as if the weight of his past was too heavy to bear. I don't regret my time as a game warden. I don't regret the work I did, but I regret the things I didn't know, the things I never understood about the wilderness. I've seen it up close, those forces that lie hidden, the things we can't explain. And now that I'm older, I've come to realize that no matter how strong or experienced you think you are, there are things in this world that are far beyond us. Forces that can never be controlled, never understood. And sometimes it's best to just leave them alone. His voice softened, and for a moment, there was a deep, reflective silence. The wilderness stretched out, vast and unknowable, a reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden just beyond the edge of comprehension. One thing I know for sure, Dave finally said, his voice quiet but resolute, some places should be left alone. Some things should remain hidden, because if you disturb them, you might never leave. And with that, he fell silent once more, the fire's last embers flickering out, leaving only the dark, silent forest around them, as if the land itself had heard the truth and agreed to keep it. The invisible forces of nature, ancient and unknowable, stood watch over the wilderness, guarding its secrets as they always had and always would.